For thousands of years, the sprawling lands that would eventually become Canada were inhabited by hundreds of distinct First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. They adapted to some of the most unforgiving climates on Earth, governing vast stretches of temperate rainforests and frozen tundra long before any European empire knew this continent existed. When European navigators like Leif Erikson and later John Cabot finally made landfall on the eastern shores, they were searching for quick wealth and direct Western trade routes to Asia. Instead, they hit an impenetrable wall of extreme weather and dense wilderness, forcing early Norse settlements to simply pack up and abandon their remote outposts within 2 decades. French explorers identified a more reliable source of wealth: fur. To control this lucrative trade, colonial authorities established tight, highly regulated settlements along the St. Lawrence River, strictly ordering their trappers to stick to established, pre-approved routes. Those suffocating regulations pushed 2 ambitious French traders, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers, to go rogue. After venturing deep into the northern wilderness and hauling back a massive bounty of prime pelts, the French government fined them and confiscated their furs. Furious, the duo took their geographic intelligence straight to the English, securing royal funding for a massive corporate expedition into the Northern Bay. King Charles II granted a royal charter to the newly formed Hudson's Bay Company, handing them a massive monopoly over every river flowing into the bay. The continent was suddenly split in two: a sprawling British corporate empire dominating the frozen north, and a deeply entrenched French colonial network controlling the south. These 2 superpowers were locked on a collision course. But how does a frozen frontier, artificially carved up by bitter imperial and corporate rivals, avoid tearing itself apart to eventually form one of the world's most stable democracies? The tipping point arrived during the 7 Years' War, when the British decided to crush French power in North America once and for all. In 1759, British troops executed a daring climb called the Jagged Cliffs, protecting Quebec under the cover of night. When the sun rose, they formed up on the Plains of Abraham, decimated the French defenders, and effectively ending French colonial rule in Canada. With the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, the British Empire fully absorbed the territory, but they quickly realized they lacked the resources to rule a massive population of French Catholics through sheer oppression. They made a highly pragmatic compromise, officially agreeing to protect the civil rights, language, and religion of the French inhabitants to keep the peace. That fragile balance shattered a decade later during the American Revolution. Tens of thousands of British loyalists fled north to escape the newly formed United States. To manage the sudden cultural friction between English-speaking Protestants and French Catholics, the British government passed the Constitution Act of 1791. They divided the territory into Upper Canada, governed by British common law, and Lower Canada, which maintained French civil law. This uneasy coexistence was severely tested in 1812, when the United States declared war on Britain. The Americans marched their armies north, assuming that conquering the scattered, divided Canadian colonies would be an incredibly simple, effortless campaign. They severely underestimated the local resistance. At Fort Detroit, British Major General Isaac Brock partnered with Shawnee Chief Tecumseh to execute a brilliant psychological masterclass. Tecumseh marched his warriors through the surrounding woods in continuous loops, creating the terrifying illusion of a massive, overwhelming native army. Outsmarted and afraid of a brutal massacre, the American general surrendered his entire fort without a single cannon being fired. By the time the war ended in a stalemate, with borders returning exactly to their pre-war lines, something crucial had happened. English loyalists, French Catholics, and Indigenous nations had successfully repelled a mutual threat. Fighting off American invasions forced these deeply divided groups to share a common reality. They were distinctly and permanently not American. Decades later, the fear of U.S. expansionism still lingered. Realizing they needed a stronger unified economy and a coordinated defense, the fragmented colonies consolidated. In 1867, they officially formed the Dominion of Canada, becoming a self-governing country operating under their own federal government while still flying the banner of the British Empire. Political unity on paper meant very little in practice. The new nation spanned a massive, rugged continent, leaving remote Western colonies like British Columbia completely disconnected from the eastern cities by thousands of miles of rock and ice. To physically stitch the country together, the government launched a staggering engineering feat: the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The human cost of binding this continent was incredibly steep. The grueling manual labor was largely placed on the backs of thousands of heavily exploited immigrant laborers. Chinese workers in particular faced deadly conditions, blasting rock and laying track with little pay or physical protection. As the 20th century dawned, this newly physically connected nation found itself tested on the global stage. During the First World War, Canadian troops proved themselves on the bleak, muddy battlefields of Europe. At the Battle of Vimy Ridge in 1917, all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps fought together as a single unified force, accomplishing the impossible by capturing a heavily fortified German position that Allied forces had repeatedly failed to take. 2 decades later, they projected that power again during the Second World War. Canadian forces fought ferociously alongside British and American allies, storming Juno Beach during the Normandy landings and carrying out the grueling, freezing liberation of the Netherlands. The bloodshed overseas finally solidified Canada's internal identity. They had entered the World Wars largely as colonial subjects, but they emerged as a highly respected, independent military power, fully stepping out of the shadows of both Britain and the United States. In the decades following the wars, Canada made a deliberate pivot. Instead of demanding absolute assimilation from new arrivals, the government officially adopted a policy of multiculturalism, shedding its imperial baggage and opening its borders to millions of immigrants from across the globe. This policy didn't erase their historical internal divides, but it changed how they managed them. When the long-standing friction between English and French Canadians led to a serious Quebec separatist movement, the nation settled the issue not with violence, but through democratic, highly contentious referendums. Today, despite being formed from deeply fractured, competing colonies, Canada stands as a massive economic powerhouse, widely recognized for its high standard of living, its stability, and its incredibly diverse population. The nation was forged in a deeply unforgiving crucible. It required the ancient adaptation of Indigenous peoples, the pragmatic legal compromises between bitter French and British rivals, and a desperate political unification to ward off an aggressive American neighbor. The necessity to compromise to survive the freezing wilderness and global empires became the exact DNA that allows the nation to thrive today. These survival mechanisms, forged through historical conflict, have evolved into the multicultural principles that define modern Canadian democracy.